Hello, everyone. My name is Teneille Gibson, and I'm a senior digital multimedia journalist at Channel 4. Tracee?
Hi, everybody. I'm Tracee Wilkins, investigative reporter with the News 4 I team. Hello, everyone.
So, Tracee and we just finished a big project called The Next Migration. Tracee, take us away from why we wanted to do it's actually a 4-part series on Roku and Amazon Fire, and it was also our Celebrating Black Heritage special, and you can also watch it on our channels on Samsung and Roku. But this all originated from one 2-minute package with Tracee last year. So Tracee, tell me about when you first covered this story last year.
Yeah, so this is unusual. It doesn't, but this story was one that we found from the Washington Post and its work that its digital analysts had done, investigating the numbers and what they were seeing in terms of trends in our area after just basically going through census data. And they found that the population had shifted and that a lot of the wealth that was in Prince George's County had moved down to Charles County, which was like, what, mind blown. So we did just a short package on it. And Teneille, you called me and said, I think that this is a bigger story. I think that we should do something more in depth. And then it just took off from there. So that was like last summer. October, we really started to put this piece together and worked on it all the way up through January and debuted it in February. So we learned a lot along the way doing this project, learned a lot about what we wanted to do was go behind the numbers and the motivation for why people were leaving Prince George's County and moving to Charles, what was motivating them, and just have these conversations with leadership, with residents, and just get into the why. And I think we did a really good job of doing that as much as we could in the time period that we had to do it.
Let's play the trailer.
There is not a community like this anywhere in America. Celebrate the diversity we have and the achievement. Nowhere.
When you're here, you realize, oh, this is Black bougie heaven.
A magazine highlighting all in Black excellence in 2006 declared Prince George's County, Maryland, the wealthiest majority Black county in America.
People would say, if you come here and then if you leave, you'll understand how special this thing is called Prince George's County.
As more upper middle class Black families packed the suburban enclave east of D.C., its median income continued to rise.
I don't have enough words for it. I'm so proud to be a part of a county like this one.
With its golf courses, gated communities, large homes, and mega churches, at one point it was the second wealthiest county in Maryland, nirvana for middle and upper middle class Blacks.
Martin Luther King Jr. was killed tonight in Memphis, Tennessee.
The migration here started from the turbulence that rocked Chocolate City.
A lot of what motivates Black people is what motivates every American to get a better quality of life. It's housing, jobs, education, and that's why people move to Prince George's County.
I'm proud, how I feel about Prince George's County.
Sure.
Because these people they poured into us is how I feel.
Oh, absolutely. This neighborhood, like this all Black middle class community, we were the Huxtables.
That's what it felt like.
So I wondered, why are so many of the richest Black Prince Georgians leaving my hometown?
What drives Black migration?
Economic opportunity often is a big driver.
The move south was initially met with hate.
Fire investigators are on the scene of a massive early morning blaze in Charles County.
But that did not stop the migration of thousands farther south.
We are here. Charles County is moving forward.
I believe Charles County was made for us to be here in this time, in this season.
It was a no-brainer for us that Charles County was the place to be for us.
Black people in particular, have been striving for the American dream, probably more so than any other group.
I'm News 4 investigative reporter Tracee Wilkins, and this is a look at the next migration.
Wow.
Yeah. I want to say this because Teneille won't, but just, for those of you who have not seen the piece yet, it is a beautiful piece. Teneille shot every frame of video, edited, put all of that together, and is just an amazing producer. And we worked together on the Melvin Lindsay piece as well from last year, where again, just a beautiful presentation of amazing storytelling. So not only is it informative, but it is a really good looking, well edited, well put together piece. So kudos to Teneille, who will never give herself her own kudos. Did a fantastic job.
Thanks, Tracee.
So we're really, of course, so we're really excited to welcome into this conversation Chryl Laird, who is a professor with the University of Maryland, College Park. She does work in government and politics, among many other things, and is a published author as well. So good to see you, Chryl. Thank you for joining us.
It's good to see you both. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, so Chryl was a part of this piece. And, I know when you saw, I'm sure, Chryl, when you saw the piece, you were thinking, we talked for like an hour. And I was in there for like 2 minutes. And man, it was like church, sitting in your office having a conversation about why African Americans migrate from one place to the next. And it was so informative, and we learned a lot. And then we went and talked to a whole bunch of other people, and our time kept getting squeezed down. But I want to ask you, what kind of feedback have you been getting on the piece, and what have you been hearing around the university?
Yeah, I've been getting a lot of positive feedback about the piece. People have been telling me that they really relate to a lot of the stories that were told in there. I think it was extraordinary that you also brought in your own personal narrative into that space. I have all my challenges with objectivity that comes with some of the work that you and I both do, as well as Teneille. And so the idea that you would bring that in and center that as part of the overarching conversation and thinking around what is going on in Black communities, I thought was really great. And also the input from all the different people who have lived in the region, who have moved, all those who have lived in Prince George's County or are currently still there. It was just really great in all that came together with it. And I also think that people resonated with a lot of what was going on there. I had even staff members and faculty members who were emailing me, contacting me about their own thinking around their homes in Prince George's County, cost of living considerations. I have a staff member here who's retiring, and she talked about, the consideration she's making about the increased cost of living in the region and what she would do in response to that, and potentially a migration is what she's considering as a way to deal with that.
Yeah, I thought it was important for us to talk about, and yes, we kind of told this story starting from the perspective of my own family story. We were fourth generation. I'm a fourth generation Washingtonian. So my grandfather came up to DC from North Carolina, joining his dad, who was already here. And, he and my grandmother got married, and, I kind of tell a little bit of the story there. My grandmother, at the same time, my maternal grandmother, was coming up from South Carolina, and she and her husband started their family in Northeast. I had family in Northeast and Northwest. Shortly after the riots happened, my parents decided, we want to move into Prince George's County. And it was a neighbor, actually, who had moved there first, and they came over for a party and bought some land right around the corner and had their home built there. And that's where I was raised, in Beltsville. But my sister had already been born by the time they moved into the house. But a lot of what shifted, what was important for them was education, land, having a larger home. And that's what motivated a lot of the Black people who moved out of Washington into Prince George's County in the late 60s, early 70s. The motivation was, we want something better. We saw that from my childhood friend's parents, and her mom talked about that. And in this one, we found that it was still the same. I thought what was really interesting is that we had people who were asking a lot of questions about crime and how much did crime play a part in, because we know crime is going up in urban areas all across our country. It's happening in Washington. It's happening in some sections of Prince George's. In other sections, they'd say, what crime? It really depends on where you live in the county. If you are close to that DC line, there's definitely a higher crime rate there than there is, for instance, in Laurel, right? So, so there were people who were asking me that. How much did that play a part? Not one person we talked to mentioned it. But what they did talk about, they talked about taxes. They talked about more house for less money. They talked about kind of moving away from a metropolitan feel and wanted to get out into the country. But we had a conversation about this, Dr. Laird. If you could just talk a little bit about some of the motivating factors and what's going on when people, as you hear that this is what folks who we talked to said. Does it surprise you, or does it fall in line with what you have seen in your own research?
So, there's a lot of layers to it. So I'm going to unpack it a bit and think about, the considerations that people are making. And one of the things you noted too is property ownership. And for the African-American community, this has been something that's been difficult to obtain. Historically, there's been just a denial to property ownership, or even a stripping away of property from Black people, even when they do own it, or a denial even of giving said resources to Black people. When we think about eras of periods like Reconstruction with 40 acres and the mule as the promise of what we would be getting post-slavery. And also there are factors that people are considering as well, of where you want your family to be, what's most comfortable for you, and is the environment and the context in which you're going to reside one that's going to be comfortable for your family and the community that you want to build. And so when you talk even about your family members migrating from the South, it's really a part of the broader migration story, because that was a push out of the South in large part because of some of the violence and the conduct that was being done against Black people, and pull factors of economic opportunity. And so, we see the emergence, particularly in the 1930s, 1940s, 1950s, after FDR puts in policies around housing, where we see an increased opportunity for everybody to obtain this thing known as the American dream, right? And that this is something that's going to give opportunity for the everyday person to be able to seize on the idea that I can own a home, I can own land, I can own a place of my own. And we're going to do it through this process of basically giving you 30-year mortgages. You're going to be able to have them backed and supported by the federal government. They'll be subsidized in some cases based off of, if you got a VA loan or a FHA loan. And in that design, African Americans are explicitly, deliberately, and intentionally denied that resource, right? So there is a very, very, very strong desire for property ownership and a challenge consistently with being able to gain access to that, that historically has followed the community and has been done through government and state power. So now when we think about people in Prince George's County, it really puts into context what they're making in terms of their considerations. And in large part, there are definitely pull factors that might be something that people are thinking about, because as you noted, many of the people in the documentary spoke about increased taxes, right? The increased price of living, the cost of living going up, also wanting to have communities that their children are going to feel good in, and that fits kind of what they've imagined their American dream looking like, which may be larger properties, larger homes. But there's also, certain things you have to think about as well. For you to maintain a property, for your property to increase in value, for that wealth that would be cross-generational, right? That asset can be transferred over to the children and to future generations of your family. A lot of that depends on the value of your home increasing. And there are ways in which other things around you can also diminish the value of the home, in addition to the fact that African Americans residing in a home in and of itself diminishes value of the home in our real estate practices. Although there have been housing laws that I can go into detail about more, there still is a thing that occurs now where African Americans residing in a home, if white individuals were residing in that home, it would have more value to it, even though we're supposedly not supposed to have that happen. So if I'm somebody who owns a home, I have to think about those things. And all those considerations can tie together a lot. So something like an increased influx of people that leads to a heavier concentrations of individuals in particular parts of the county that may increase demands on resources or constrain resources could easily lead to an increase in other types of concerns and issues that homeowners may be worried about, and also that being part of a larger consideration and calculus for other reasons for why they might potentially move to other areas around Prince George's County.
One of the points, and we didn't really get into this in the piece, but we talked about it with several of the folks we interviewed, redlining, and how Washington, and I mean, there have been recent articles on how it's becoming even more segregated now than it has been in the past. It's just, insane when you think about it, that the segregation is getting worse. But that the way that these communities were set up, there were some communities that were easier for African Americans to access and others that weren't as easy. So like, for instance, where we're from, where I was raised in Beltsville, we were on a side of Beltsville where there were a majority African American families living there, but on the other side of the railroad tracks, literally, on the other side of the railroad tracks, on the other side of Route 1, you had a more diverse and, well, I wouldn't even say more diverse when we first moved in. Majority white people lived on the other side of Beltsville, and had more access to things that they could walk to, like shopping and the post office and, whatever else. It was on that side of the city, or it's not a city, it's not incorporated. But on our side, we had to get in the car to drive wherever we were going to go, which was fine because that's what my parents wanted. But in reality, it was that redlining that kind of, decided where you were going to go in the entire region. So it was harder to get homes in some parts of the area, which then impacts what you discussed, the wealth and what you're able to pass on to your family as well. So there were a lot of little crevices we couldn't really talk about. And I want to move into the next part that we couldn't get into as much as we wanted to, and that's education. And what happened with the Prince George's County school system and how that impacted a lot of folks. And then I also just want to remind, and Teneille, I don't know if you're seeing any questions coming from anybody, but if anyone has a question, please put it in the chat because we'd love to hear from you.
Well, we have one comment. Kelly responded, I've heard that the home values in Prince George's County are lower compared to the other areas in the DMV.
Yes. That is true. And that would be based a lot on some of what is being talked about here, right? Like when redlining practices are happening, like I think one of the things that people should understand about the historical practice of redlining, and also just housing broadly construed, is redlining was supported and funded and like completely legal up until we had housing laws. It was promoted by realtor organizations. It was promoted by government entities, saying that it is necessary to do redlining to ensure the value of white homes stay protected. And so by doing so, one of the things that was seen as something that would deter from the value of the home was the presence of Black people. And if we look across the country, practices of even trying to push white people out of their homes were often done like blockbusting, where you would take a Black person and have them walk through the neighborhood and then tell all the white people that Black people are moving there. And suddenly all the white people get scared. They quickly sell their homes to individuals who decide that they're going to do things like contract leasing, and then they sell those homes to Black people. Those Black people actually never own their homes, and they're instead paying a monthly debt, assuming that it's going to lead to home value, home gains, and even things like equity, right, in your home, which is stuff that you can use in drawing on your property, home lines of credit, and various things to make other gains in your life, especially when you're thinking about this idea of the American dream. So that historical practice is one that has gone on and now has been outlawed, but no one ever went back and rectified it. It's not as if we did some proactive policy to say that this is something we did. So the vestiges of that live on. Montgomery County is right next door to Prince George's County, and they recently just started publishing from some of the work that they're doing, the practices of restrictive covenants on houses and how far back those went and for how long. I mean, these were things where my mother is in her 70s, and there were restrictive covenants that were still enforced and in place in homes in the Tacoma Park area, in the downtown Silver Spring area, in areas that we typically now see as having a lot of Black and brown people, but that had historically been restricted. And the laws that they had on the books in those restrictive covenants, which basically was something that stipulated in the deed of sale of the home that the home cannot be sold to people of a particular race. And they might specify which race it is. It could just say the non-white race or races. And they would say things like, it's because those non-white race people have diseases. They will bring health issues to the neighborhood and the community. They are unsafe. So the actual bodies of Black people living their lives in their homes is actually valued less. And assessments from people who do things about your assets and your homes, particularly we think about appraisers, 97%, I want to say 95 to 97% of appraisers are white. And not too long ago, even in Baltimore, a faculty member at Johns Hopkins University, an African-American professor, found his home getting assessed by an appraiser by hundreds of thousands of dollars below value because he was Black. And he knows that for sure because he switched himself out, took down all of the Black art on his wall, brought in a white colleague from the university, had them stand there when the appraiser came, and the value of the home increased by twofold. Like, it was insane. And so that practice really speaks volumes then to the challenges that even living out the American dream for Black people come with, because even when you do everything right, you still find that the value of the homes, if those houses had white people living in them, if those houses were in Montgomery County, the same houses, and county lines are just drawn things, like we could just draw a new one if we wanted to, but if those houses were in other locations or had different people living in them that are white, it just automatically shifts not only the value of the home, but it even shifts the investments that are made by developers into the communities.
Yes, which is part of what we're seeing. And that's a great segue into what's happening in Charles County right now. And that was one of the quotes that was in our piece that Teneille and I talked about. Like, we can't put this in because we don't have enough time to build the foundation under, when the president of the commissioners in Charles County said, you know, with the wealth that we have down here now, with a median income of more than $100,000, you think about that, a median income of more than $100,000, that is greater than the national median income of, you know, some $70,000. He said, now that we have all of this wealth here, where's our Apple store? Where are our, you know, big restaurants? And, you know, why doesn't it look like an affluent county if it is an affluent county? And Prince Georgians will tell you racism. You know, there have been all kinds of issues. I mean, like, we'll tell you what the problem is. It has nothing to do with income. I mean, Prince George's has been fighting for decades to have the kind of amenities that were in the county when African Americans first migrated into the county, that just kind of went away. Like, in my mind, I'm thinking about Landover Mall, where my sister worked at the Limited when she was in high school and in college. You know, we had high-end stores there. We had a Garfinkel's. We had, you know, all of these places that we could go. We had restaurants where you could sit down with a white tablecloth, and then suddenly all of that was gone, and the county's been fighting to get it back. And been making these little incremental improvements. National Harbor, a major improvement, but there are parts of the county where we have a lot of development happening, like, for instance, in the College Park, where there's been some real intentional work about building around that Route 1 corridor. And then other parts of the county, like, for instance, the Forestville or Suitland, where Suitland's beginning to get some work done. They're also beginning to do some work on the Blue Line corridor. And I think that when those projects are done, we're going to see a real shift in what's happening in Prince George's County. But for years,
Tracee, I have a question.
Yeah.
Tracee, I have a question for, you know, for both of you. You're talking about the development along the border there. There's been articles about how other residents are moving into those neighborhoods, and they're starting to see a difference, and it's not Black people. Those border communities along Prince George's County is starting to gentrify, you know, from what it's been historically.
So, somebody sent me an article. No, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Teneille.
And I also, just throwing that out there, I want to segue to another comment from Kelly. She hasn't watched the documentary yet, but she's curious about the migration of other groups to the county and their impact on the current migration. And, you know, that was one of the stats that the reporter from the Post emphasized, that we're not saying the residents of the county is decreasing. It's still a massive county.
And so that's part of so there are two things that, first of all, Teneille, and I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt what you were saying, but I wanted to show you this clip the other day that someone sent me from a realtor who was talking about his property in Temple Hills, that he was, and it was like, wow, this is really interesting. And folks were sending it to me like, what does this mean? You know, this is very interesting to see. because of who his normal audience is in the homes that he, kind of sells across the area, they were really interested in what was happening with him in Temple Hills and what this was signaling in terms of who's moving into those communities. Which is, it's just all interesting. I'm here for what's going to be happening in another 10 years. But the other question about the influx, you're right. So Prince George's County, Charles County can fit into Prince George's County 4 times, right? So although it's a majority Black county and has, now holds the title of the majority wealth, it is nowhere near the size of Prince George's County. Prince George's County is the second largest county in Maryland, has nearly 1 million residents in it. It is massive. There's a lot of land, and from rural to, everything else is in the county. And yes, there is an influx of specifically Hispanic and Asian Americans into Prince George's County. And so part of what we're seeing in the shift of the demographic with African Americans is that their piece of the pie is just getting a little smaller. While they're still the majority, there are other folks coming in as we're seeing some African Americans leave, and that's what's happening. So we had, our own NBC data and folks go through all of these numbers and take another look at what was happening with the census. We didn't just rely on the data that came from the Washington Post when their data analyzers realized there's a shift in the region. We took a quadruple check and saw just from IRS data, folks who filed in Prince George's County, then the next year were filing in Charles. And we found that some 56% of the people who are living in Charles County, they came from Prince George's. But Cheryl, I want to get in a little bit to education, because that was the second motivating factor. We heard that from folks who were moving from DC to Prince George's, and then we heard it again from Prince George's who were moving, or Prince Georgians who were moving down to Charles County. Can you talk a little bit about the part that education plays in the decisions that these families make?
Absolutely. So education is one of the big drivers when it comes to where you're going to live. And part of that is because school districts and how they're funded are often dependent on property taxes, right? And so they get their monies from the ownership of homes and properties in the area and in the county system like we have here from the county. And that money is what goes and typically funds the schools. Parents will search, Google, research all types of things related to the type and quality of the public education that is being offered. Assessments, though, of public education are very challenging, though, because they are also very much laden with racial implications within them. So inherently, there is already a negative attribution of a quality of a school that will be given if the school is predominantly Black or brown, right? Or is comprised of students that are predominantly Black or brown. Additionally, the amount of resource that is then able to fund the schools and go for each individual student could be constrained by the amount of property tax that is being generated and revenue, the investment into the type of school, right? So how are you able to attract talent, the types of teachers and educators into the space? There could be other counties where around the area that may have more appeal because maybe the salaries are higher, or maybe they have more in terms of benefits that they're going to offer, and has more pedigree or prestige attached to it. So people may not then come to the areas where there is need in an area like a Prince George's County. They might choose to go to an Anne Arundel or a Montgomery County, right? Because of some other kind of considerations and factors. And so education ties a lot then to how someone determines a house. And it's interesting because depending on your class level, obviously the more you can make considerations about where you're going to move than people who are in a lower income bracket, where your choices may be much more limited, and thus then you will find yourself in public education versus those individuals who could choose between public or private, or even choose which public schools they specifically want to be jurisdictioned into, right? So then buying my home in a jurisdiction for a certain school in the county may make a difference between the quality of education that I'm able to obtain for my child versus someone who does not have a similar choice. Additionally, we also have to think about the concentration of children who qualify for free or reduced lunch, because that is typically the indicator that is used for determining poverty. And in Black communities, brown communities, what we typically see is because of white flight in a lot of cases, and Prince George's County would be an example. PG County had a large concentration of white people before Black people moved in from DC, as was noted in the documentary. But when white flight often happens, it does leave behind people of color frequently. And often those who also don't get to leave out of certain areas are concentrated heavily in communities that have lower resource or poorer. And that then leads to those children then being concentrated in schools. And I don't care what color the child is, if you concentrate poor children in schools at high levels, those schools will have downturn in their quality because those children are dealing with basic needs that are not being met. Therefore, when it comes to things in the classroom and education, it is going to be a significant challenge to be able to meet what they need because these other things at the bottom of their needs hierarchy are just not happening. And so that kind of intentionality of considering pocketing kids who are poor together, what happens when, instead of having mixed income communities, you have communities that are lower income, because that's something that has also occurred in Prince George's County, where you have upper middle class Blacks having the option to choose the subdivision that they want to live in based off of a school, which means that they can also choose to not live near low income Black individuals or brown individuals if they determine that the concentration of those children or the concentration of those communities leads to a school quality that is not necessarily favorable to what they're looking for. So you have racial flight, you have class flight, and that then leading to a lot of challenges within the education system, let alone the fact that the education system is comprised disproportionately of Black and brown kids.
So I want to speak to a little bit about that education piece and how important it is, because I'm a product of the public school system in Prince George's County. My sister was too, and her kids are now in Prince George's County, products of the public school system, and have had wonderful educations. And I was talking about this in the piece, that we saw that shift. Like literally, I was involved in activities in my high school where I was the only Black kid in high school, or one of two or three. Now the demographics of my high school have completely shifted, and it's all first generation Americans, and it's just a very different kind of school. One of the things that Dr. Thornton talked about was, or I should say school body, or the makeup of the school, but one of the things that Dr. Thornton talked about was that tax caps and other issues made it very difficult for Prince George's County to build new public schools for years. And that there were all kinds of, and so because of that, what you're talking about and the idea of building community around schools that would attract families to specific areas, it was hard for the county to do it. They didn't have the money, they didn't have their percentage of what the state would donate to new construction, which is why all of this new construction, and this is what the county executive also Brooks points to in the documentary, all of these new middle schools that they're building and these new private-public partnerships that they're coming up with, it's all in an effort to try and get the middle class and upper middle class back into the public school system, because they just cannot abandon the public school system en masse as they have in Prince George's County. It's hard for the community to flourish when that happens. And I think that, so we see the results of that in places that are really critical, like the hospital system. You want your best doctors in the region to live in the community where they work. The idea behind the new hospital in Prince George's County is now let's get community around that and schools nearby where doctors want to come and move into Prince George's County and live and work here. And the same thing with the University of Maryland. Let's build a community around that where we can get the best professors in the country to come live and work here and know that they have a place where they can send their kid and afford to send their kid to school. So trying to support all of the things that they have in the county and the amenities they have, it really does go back to education choices and options, which takes us down to Charles, because the recent stats just came out from the Maryland State Department of Education. Charles County's English and math scores are like, this is Prince George's and this is Charles. It's not that much of a difference. Like they're separated by 1 or 2 points, right? And we found a massive number, twice the number of parents down there who were doing homeschooling in Charles as well. I'm sorry, go ahead.
That was a comment under one of our posts. Someone wanted to know, why is homeschooling in Charles County twice as high as in Prince George's County?
I would say that homeschooling is probably higher because of the class of people that are going to be in Charles County, right? So the shift of people that we're seeing moving to Charles County are upper middle class Blacks. They have the privilege and the resource of time to be able to homeschool their kids. Like I have a 4-year-old. He goes to school here at the care facility on campus. But I have a lot of latitude in my schedule that if one day I opted and decided that I wanted to homeschool my son, I probably would be able to pull it off without much of a difficulty and maintain a full-time job because I'm a professor and I pick my schedule and I pick my classes and I determine what I'm going to do in my day for most of my time. And when you have a white-collar job, that just becomes a possibility. You can also hire people, right? You have much more resource available. You may have people who can come and do it. You may, as a collective, maybe 3 families, 4 families, more, might decide we're going to collectively come together and pay a teacher to come and teach our children. And there's something also that's to be said, I think, around the education system, because it is a space of socialization for young people, right? From those ages that you're in school, it is socializing you to a particular understanding of the world. And there are a lot of Black people who have become more aware of the fact that educational systems are often a problem for Black children, that they tend to reinforce stereotypes about what it means to be Black, that there is limitation in the curriculum of the kind of content that's even covered, and that it doesn't cover things that people find relatable or speaking to the issues and the concerns that face their communities. And so there's like an asymmetry, right? Like that basically you don't see, it's a Eurocentric curriculum being taught to Black children, and that's fine, but it does mean that a lot of people aren't necessarily going to be fond of that because it's not inclusive of their own lived experience. So homeschooling allows for a lot more latitude, and you can bring in the things that you want to learn in there with a more Afrocentric type of curriculum base, maybe even having Black teachers who are going to be able to do that for you, or you as a parent being able to do that. And those who are in Prince George's County who do not have those means, who are much more resource constrained, who work hourly jobs, just may not have the time available or even the education themselves to be able to do that for their children. I have a PhD, so I'm not an educator necessarily in early childhood development per se, but do I think I could probably get myself caught up enough to be able to teach my son as he's going along? Yeah, because I do it for a living. I'm not going to be as great as a person who studied necessarily education for K through 12, but that's not necessarily the only consideration that some families are making with about the type of education, the type of experience, and how their child is being socialized, being a very important thing that they want to have much more of a hand in, and that the system has often failed to do at times for Black kids.
Shirley hit the nail on the head, as you always do, with what we heard from parents. I mean, and the more educated a parent, the more they question what their children are being taught in school when they have Black kids. And we have heard this from around the region where it's like, wait a minute, what's in this book? And especially if you went to a school where you learned African American studies, you now have a better idea, or you went to an HBCU or whatever the education may be, or you were just well read on your own, even without a college education, and said, I have a better understanding and I expect my child to have that. More and more parents are becoming concerned about what their kids are learning. On the other hand, it also is beneficial for kids, I don't care what their income is, to have a real understanding of self taught to them in their school systems. And probably part of the issue of what's happened, a school system like Prince George's County would be a great system to really put some of that into the curriculum, or more of it into the curriculum, so that all children are getting a better understanding of who they are and self, regardless of income. But you're absolutely right that the idea of parents feeling like, in order for me to have a full education for my child that includes a version of what they look like outside of the month of February, I'm going to have to take them out of the school system. It's scary, but there are parents there who have more options, who have more time, and are making decisions. And in large part, it's because they don't see themselves or their children properly represented in the public education. And that's just how they feel about what the state of Maryland is teaching its kids, not just individual counties.
Absolutely.
We've heard the same complaints in Virginia too.
Absolutely. And I mean, it doesn't help that they're doing the book banning. Right? I mean, like that just sends like such a freezing effect into the space, right? Like when we think about education, and I am a Black politics professor, I literally, after this is over, an hour after this, I'll be teaching my class Black politics to my students here at the University of Maryland. But curricular wise, I went to Montgomery County schools. I'm originally from Tacoma Park, and lived in Wheaton, Maryland for most of my childhood. But I can remember the one class that I took on Black studies when I was in high school, probably at my junior year. And that just feels like that probably should have happened sooner. Now I think about times where maybe things were woven in that were related to the Black community, but outside of February, most of the time you didn't really learn about anything related to that. But I happened to also be in a school where your touch points with people from other communities was very commonplace. And so often you learn from just interaction as opposed to study. But there are ways that you can really try to take a hand on that. And I think the Prince George's County school system, the school board, can consider those things, because I think there is a way in which education is defined that seems to say that only a model of education that relies on a lens that is more Eurocentric based is the proper and appropriate form of education. And that anything else that deviates from that is something that is just an elective, it's extra, and maybe even not necessary because it's giving too much attention and focus to those communities when we shouldn't be emphasizing race. Like we're taking a colorblind approach. And I'm like, yes, but we're not taking a colorblind approach when you're in school, you spend time learning about the great writers, and what they bring you are white men who've written novels, right? Like I love Steinbeck, but there are lots of people I can think of that we could be reading that's not Steinbeck. Or we read Shakespeare and we talk about Shakespeare for, every year of high school, if I can remember correctly. Right?
Every year, yeah.
Like there's always a book, we read Homer, and we look at the Odyssey, and we, like I can think of off the top of my head, like all the books we read Night, which was great because it talks about the Jewish community, but like Eli Wiesel is a white Jewish man, even though Jewish is a race in and of itself, but like in the United States, they get racialized as white. So like that all plays into, how we learn about stuff. And that's great because in my case, my school was doing a lot of that. Like, let's bring in other cultures. Like Night was one of my favorite books to read because it brought into, the existence and the understanding of what went on during the Holocaust and the Diary of Anne Frank. And, but there's kind of like one-off books that they'll give you and not really bring it in the curriculum deeply and intentionally. And it can be done. And you can bring in lots of different ways to think about identity into the school system. But I think that there's often fear to do that. I think that there is assumption about quality of education and maybe a decline in that. But I do think from the other side of it, my students, when they come to my class, most of them are coming from school districts around the country where they do not talk about topics of Black politics or Black life. And so in my class, they are hungry to know more. And once they start to learn that, especially for students of color, they really have an epiphany about what their life has been and why things have kind of looked the way it's looked, and that they're not alone in seeing that experience, that others have gone through it too. And in some ways, there may be even things that could potentially increase the educational performance of our kids in all areas of their work: math, science, technology, all of that, reading, English literacy, that if we were thinking in that capacity, they probably would perform a bit better because we would be giving them the things that they want to know.
Exactly. And then teaching it to them in a way that it makes sense, just culturally makes sense. So yes, the canon needs help for sure. Okay. So I want to jump to the end of what we did at the end of the piece with my stand-up at the very end of the story, where I said, we as African Americans have migrated around this country since enslavement, normally looking for safety, for better education, for better opportunities, a better life. But it begs the question, what would happen if we stood still and built community where we are? And I want to get into that part because what I got out of everything that we learned is that, man, we really lose a lot every time we move in math. The idea of middle-class families, I love the way that Dr. Thornton put it in our piece, seeking enclaves for their children. moving them out of the public school system, putting them in private schools or parochial schools and the rest of it, that we then just cause there's a lack of stability within the school system when that happens, a lack of diversity. And children are only seeing other kids who look like them, as opposed to what my father used to say about Howard. You meet all kinds of Black people at Howard University. You meet all kinds of, Black people in HBCUs. So the idea that we are separating ourselves from one another, our community is just not as strong as it is. Wherever we go, it's not as strong as it could be when we keep moving and moving and moving. What are your thoughts about that, about the idea of standing strong and building community where we are and demanding better systems where we are as opposed to moving?
I'm all for it. I mean, I think that there is a lot to be said about what stability brings to communities and trying to fight for resources to be accessible and available for your neighborhoods. When I grew up, my family lived in one house, the same house, and I lived there my entire time. And there is something to be said about not having to make new friends over again, not having to make new ties over again, that the people that we knew are the same people that we knew over time. And for a low-income family like my parents were, and that we were, it helped to make things easier. But that also means that, when you recognize that resources are constrained or limited, that you also have a collective of social ties that would allow for you to be able to go and push for and advocate for you guys to gain and obtain access to those things. And so I remember when my neighborhood didn't have a park in it, and eventually a park came. And that was something that was advocated for by the neighborhood, because it was like, there is nowhere for the children to play. Let's figure out a way to get this thing here. And over time, I was very happy to come back and see that the park was still there. Does it need a little maintenance? Yes. But is it still there? Yeah, it's still there. And it's kind of a proud symbol of the efforts that can be done. We also know that social ties and the ability to maintain those over time are important for advocacy work, just broadly construed. When we think about the civil rights movement and the willingness of people to take a risk, to put their lives on the line, even in some cases, for the issues that were of concern at that time, a lot of those relationships that were able to make that happen were very strong social bonds that people had with one another, where they were willing to trust what was being done as something that if we are all in this together, then we are going to be able to make a change. And I think sometimes especially when it comes to class, and we often don't like to talk about it because it seems like divisive within the Black community, but it is a thing that does play a factor in some of this, right? Where people decide that they want to make community. Different class brackets may not want to make community necessarily across brackets, especially in the wake of integration, right? So that's something that really does shift a lot of the possibility, integration and access to resources that upper middle class Blacks may be able to access, but lower middle class Blacks don't. And so how one sees community, very much it will internalize then the way in which they would determine if they want to sit and plant roots and say that I'm going to stay and make change, or if they feel like they need to go somewhere else to try to find that. But even what we saw in the documentary is, right, that Black people moving to Charles County are still wanting to be there in community, right? Like enclaves is one way to do that. But it does mean that in that case, obviously economically and class-wise, there is a constraint on who is actually a part of said enclave, right? And it's going to be one that's going to lean more heavily towards an affluent set of African Americans versus those who come from middle or lower income brackets. But it matters. It matters. And familial ties also, I mean, we know historically things like highways being put in often rip Black families apart. So infrastructure wise, we've done things. There's often forced migration. If we think about something like Hurricane Katrina, Black people who had to leave out of New Orleans and move to Houston and start whole new lives. Like recently there was a documentary talking about Katrina babies and what happens to people after they not only go through this horrific experience that was incredibly racialized, but additionally, what now happens when you have to go plant new roots in a new place that you don't know. And so it can be very challenging. It can be something where it can be very disorienting. If you are now an outsider coming to another place that has already had a culture that pre-existed, people will be resistant to your arrival. And you documented that also in the documentary about the fires that Black families have experienced to their homes. I mean, that is literally like racial group threat theory in action, right? People who've lived there do not like the new arrivals, and they're making it known. So it can be a lot to do, but the ability to do it is something that is definitely driven by resource access and opportunity.
Yeah, I will say a couple of things about this. That first of all, I know that for me and all of us come from a similar background in that it's great when you go home and that's Mr. Jones' house and that's where Mr. So-and-so lived and that's where, and the people because the community has always, everybody's just kind of been there. It's so stabilizing and it's comforting to have that. And it is unfortunate when we're in communities where we're not able to have that or there are people who are moving for various reasons. But I mean, historically, we, as you said, sometimes we're kind of chased out of where we are. But if that's not the case, wow, can we do a lot with our power to unite as a community. And I do want to say that, yes, we talked about that when folks first started moving into Charles County, just as when Black people first started moving into Prince George's too, they were met with some forms of racism. In both of these counties, there were majority white residents and they were majority rural, a lot of farmers. And some of these places are former plantations where they have built these huge homes, and some of those residents are still there who were raised in a plantation system or who see the country in a very different way from the way other people are seeing it. You're always going to have some folks who are more welcoming than others. So we don't want to give the idea that people are not still dealing with racial injustice within the systems of Charles County, because we heard from everyone that they are, from business owners down to what's happening in the school systems, that the families are in a position to fight. But like Prince Georgians, when they first came in, they're ready to do that fight because they feel like it's worth it for what they believe they're going to get out of it. So very interesting. Teneille, is there anything else you'd like to add or any other questions we have?
I think we covered it all.
Yeah, this is good. This is good. I just want to say, at one point, I think it may have been right after our interview with you, Dr. Laird, we were walking out and I told Teneille, I was like, this is a good piece. Because where else are we going to have this kind of in-depth conversation? And so much of this piece, because we're talking about the shift of wealth, was focused on the Black middle class and the Black middle upper class, which I believe is one of the most invisible classes that we have, one of them. In that we talk a lot about what's happening in some of our poorer communities and how people are impacted, as we should, because we need to make wrongs right in those communities. And so we tend to put a lot of focus there. And then you have these people who just are almost invisible in the narrative when they are so responsible for driving the economy, for driving money in this country, and wealth and what that looks like, and they spend so much of their money, especially in places like Prince George's and Charles. They really help to keep America moving, as any middle class does. So I was just really happy that we took a moment to just kind of take a look at what's going on with these folks. How are they feeling in our region? And I'm really proud of the work that we did to tell that story. So thank you for being a part of the conversation. And all of your contributions are fantastic. And again, I want to shout out to Neil's incredible artistry in putting this piece together. And so, and thank you everybody for joining us for this conversation.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, if you haven't had the chance to watch The Next Migration, feel free to download the NBC4 Washington app on Roku and Amazon Fire, and it's there. And it's also on our website. So please watch and continue to share.
Yeah, and continue the conversation. We're reading your comments and, I'm answering as many of them as I can. But we're just happy that everybody is responding to the piece.
Absolutely. I've enjoyed participating in it, and thank you for having me.
Thank you. All right, everyone have a good one. Thank you again for joining us.